This is Tim Ventura from AmericanAntiGravity.com, and I am speaking today with Bill Ramsey. Bill has been working with electronic experimental projects for years and had an experience a few years ago that's very unique. I've actually been really excited about doing this interview for a long time now, and I finally had the opportunity to get it on tape. Bill, can you hear me okay?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay, for lack of a better description, I guess the event that happened to you was really kind of time displacement, wasn't it?
Yeah. Both directions.
Oh, okay. And now you told me about this, I think maybe around a year ago, and I called you up. I can't remember who referred me to you, but the minute I heard about it, it just something about it kind of struck a chord with some of the things we'd seen with the lifter experiments. And that the more you told me about it, it seemed like just incredibly interesting experience. Can you tell me a little bit more about what happened with it?
Well, I was, I had an idea for something which was based on my experience with gravity wave work, or what Greg Hodowanik has called gravity wave work. And the idea in mind was to try and integrate electromagnetic phenomena with the underlying gravity wave phenomena. And so I was just checking out a portion of the device that I was going to build. And after quite a few hours, too many hours really, of doing tests and doing charts and graphs and all of that, checking frequency responses on this particular thing, which was the heart of the unit, all of a sudden I blanked out. And I didn't really know what was going on. I thought it might have been some sort of a seizure. But I looked at a clock, and it didn't really seem to be too disturbing, so I kept doing what I was doing and left the equipment turned on. And then all of a sudden I had another spell where I blanked out and looked at the clock, and the clock had jumped some 17 minutes ahead. And then I kept on piddling and thought, well, gee, maybe I was out for those 17 minutes. And a little bit disturbed, but I wanted to finish doing my notes. And so I had another one of these experiences where I blanked out, looked at the clock, and it had jumped a full 34 minutes backwards in time. And at that point I said, I did not have any kind of a seizure. There's something weird going on here. So I observed that clock and all the others in the house, mechanical clocks and electrical, and also a few battery-operated digital clocks. And they were all pretty much doing the same thing. They jump forward and they jump backwards. And I could sit still or stand still and watch a clock, and it would be progressing normally. Then all of a sudden it would jump to another time. And during this period I'd have these periodic blankouts where I didn't have any perception of, I had no sense of anything, of time or anything around me, no sense of touch or hearing or sight or taste or smell or feeling of any kind, except that I was fully aware that something was going on. And since then, I started referring to that as the void, that somehow I'd gone to the void, but I was still aware of the void itself, even though I had no sensory perceptions.
Well, you'd suggested to me, and it could be that I'm not remembering it completely correctly, but you'd said you were suspended in a kind of a black space, and I guess your description of the void. You couldn't move. You were there for, if I remember right, 15 minutes, or perceptually around 15 minutes.
Seconds.
Oh, seconds. I'm sorry.
About 15 seconds.
15 seconds.
And I determined this afterwards. I mean, I didn't determine it myself, since I had no sense of time, movement, and couldn't see any clocks to do any kind of objective measurement. But this was only afterwards, when my wife observed me doing this blanking out, and she estimated it was about 10 to 15 seconds where I was blanked out.
And at the time that you were working with this, you were actually testing a capacitor, weren't you? If I remember correctly, you'd said something about well, my understanding had been that it was a capacitor filled with gel or a unique dielectric. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, it had the attribute of capacitance. That was one of many attributes, and it wasn't really intended to be a capacitor. What it consisted of is two piezoelectric elements, the kind that are in computers that do the little beeping when you tap on the keys, and they're used in other things as well, such as home alarms and what have you. But two of these round piezo elements consisting of a plate of brass with the piezo crystal mounted on it. And I had two of them, and I had this conductive gel in between the two. And at the time when I experienced this blanking out and the time jumping around, I was actually feeding a square wave pulse of different frequencies directly into the plates. In other words, I wasn't using the piezo element part of these little devices. So it was going from one plate through a conductive gel to the other plate. And in the conductive gel, I'd put, I guess, a couple of pinches of some powdered iron in the gel itself. The idea was that the powdered iron would vibrate with whatever was going on in the conductive gel, and that this in turn would be coupled to a coil, and that it would be changing what they call the permeability of the coil, and therefore acting in a way to sort of modulate the coil. At least that was the idea to begin with.
And this was only at a few volts, right? Just 4 or 5 volts.
Yeah, the signal generator, or function generator I was using to drive it with had an output of about 30 volts peak to peak. However, that was into a load of 50 ohms, and I found out that this device, if you want to call it that, clipped it off at just about 2 or 2.5 volts. So it obviously, as it was functioning, had a resistance or an impedance of much less than the 50 volts because it was actually loading down the function generator.
Oh, okay, okay. I've actually had a couple of experiences that might be a little bit similar, although nowhere near as profound. And it's interesting to see the perceptual aspects of this. On one occasion, I was working with the lifter and accidentally touched it, which is a big no-no because they're running at around 30,000 volts. And I had the tube of the monitor that I was using in the power supply discharged through my hand. And the experience that I'd had was actually it's like when you first wake up in the morning, really disoriented, no short-term memory, except that I was standing on my feet in the garage, standing in front of the lifter, and it was operating. And gradually, I kind of realized that, I'd been shocked, but, it was one of those things that, at the time, it didn't make any sense. However, at the same time, I never felt like from that experience there were a time effect involved, and it seems like, especially since you had the clocks there and you were able to walk around the house and look at the different clocks, it seems very interesting because, I found out later that high voltages can actually cause short-term memory loss if you get shocked, but I didn't think for a minute at the time that it was a time effect.
Yeah, I've gotten zapped by high voltage before too. That's quite an experience.
Yeah, yeah.
I had a friend who was working on a Geiger counter, and he had three 300-volt batteries in series, and had some wires hanging there, and he bent over and he got it right across his temples, set him right down on his tail.
Oh, wow.
And somebody who was next to him, just looked at him, and it was a matter of minutes before he was even conscious. And then there was this period of disorientation for quite a while.
Yeah, absolutely. The lifters have been somewhat implicated in time effects, and this is more word of mouth than anything else, but people have been really reporting back that they've been placing watches inside of lifters and timing things in the local area, and watches tend to slow down. And of course, there's no way for us to really prove that it's not from the high voltage static electricity. But it sounds like the thing that you'd experienced, the event that you'd experienced, was a lot different, partly because you were working with very low power levels.
Yeah, that's, the gel, well, there were some side effects. When I looked at the plates, for example, sometimes afterwards, rather than being brass, what was exposed was copper. So there was some sort of an electrolytic reaction which brought the copper, that's one of the alloys in the brass, brought it out. words, it got heated up in this process of doing the experiment, which I would expect since it dropped the voltage down, or actually loaded the voltage down from the 30 volts peak to peak down to about 2 or 2.5 volts. So it was actually heating a little bit in the process. And I don't begin to understand all the dynamics that were involved.
Yeah, Tom Bearden actually has told me on several occasions that I can actually offset um, gravity energy by using time energy. And unfortunately, I've been reading his latest Energy from the Vacuum book, and it's a great book, but it's aspects of it are way over my head. But it is interesting that there's this correlation, and it seems like yet again, you were working with a gravity wave detector, so it was involved with that type of research, and it's interesting to see kind of a time correlation coming out of that.
Well, it's, there are some devices that are guaranteed genuine over unity devices, and that is they put out more power or apparent power than what it takes to operate them. And I've been around a couple of these when they've been operating, and in one of them there were some big time distortions. And at the time, the fellow operating it, it was a rotary device, measured 328% efficiency. In other words, 3.28 times as much going out as what he was putting into it. And there was what I call space-time tear that took, a good hour to 2 hours to heal. There were dimensional systems that were flashing in and out, and it was really a weird experience. And there were some 20 people who observed it, so it wasn't just my subjective interpretation.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Do you remember anything about the occasion, the inventor, or the experiment?
Well, it was at a conference up in the mountains in Georgia, and there was a group of people, men and women, who were on a project who had done some experimenting with some of the Montauk work as well, and had come up with a device which was rotary magnets as well as coils, and it varied. Sometimes it didn't work at all, and sometimes it worked and it put out more energy than what it took in. But the operator, the fellow who actually made it and operated the equipment, it appears was part of the loop, because when they were in the midst of running this device, somebody came in and really raised hell with him over something. I forget exactly what it was. And this created a disturbance, and the fellow who was operating the device experienced some pretty unpleasant physical symptoms afterwards.
Oh, I've actually talked to Al Bielek a couple of times, and he's talked a little bit about Montauk. He's not the only person that has the information about the experiments there, but it's interesting. Having listened to Bielek's interview on Art Bell, which for me was one of my favorite episodes, he had talked about rotating magnetic fields also, and I guess back to your thought of space-time tears. One of the things that's been reported with a lot of the rotating magnetic field anti-gravity prototypes that people have been coming up with is that on the rare occasion that they do work, they produce lots of side effects that you would associate with warping of space-time, like, I guess a black fog. It's not really a fog, but it affects light, or a clear silvery surface, which again is a light effect. Devices run very cold, which has been interesting. It almost makes me wonder if they're putting the energy somewhere else from here.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. The universe that our modern day scientists are mapping out and expanding their knowledge of, and all of that is just a small percentage of what is really out there. And recently, the estimates of the amount of the universe is so-called dark matter, they call it energy matter now, the two being somewhat equivalent. And the estimates keep going up, and the latest one I heard was 99.9% is, or more, is dark energy and matter, and that's the part of the universe that we know very little about. And that's obviously, if that's what most of the universe is, then that's got to be where most of the action of the universe is taking place, whether we're aware of it or not.
Yeah. Well, one of the things about conventional science that I think makes your story that much more relevant is that, that the observational evidence, the day-to-day observations are really kind of the backbone of conventional science. And theory works well, but it can only go so far on its own without being supported by experiments. And when a person like yourself comes along and has an experience like this, where they move through time and they experience an effect that no one else has gone through, um, it kind of adds another perspective. And one of the things that I'd like to ask is how this experience has changed your thoughts on physics, because it's possible, that having had the time to go back and look over it, you might have come to some different conclusions about the way time and energy work.
Well, that experience was some 14 years ago, and I've pondered and reflected on it quite a bit. The one thing we haven't mentioned so far is that the time jumping was one aspect of it, but there was another aspect as well. I was a little wondering what was going on during those periods of time when I blanked out. So and this was about 3:30 in the morning when all of this happened. It was on an April morning in South Carolina, and my wife had gotten up to go to the bathroom, so I made sure she was awake. She's pretty slow in waking up. I made sure she was awake, and all I was wearing at the time was a robe, and so I stood in front of a wall that had some pots and pans hanging on it and asked her to just watch me for a while, and she did. And during those periods when I experienced a blanking out of all sensory perception, she reported that I became totally invisible. She could see the wall behind me very clearly.
Oh, now, could she see it through you, or did you just disappear entirely?
I just wasn't there according to her perceptions.
Well,
And the way she reported it afterwards was that she said it was almost identical to the transporter on the series Star Trek, where there was a sort of a twinkling and then a flickering where I was here and not here, just not real substantial. And then all of a sudden, I just flickered totally gone. And she could see the wall behind me. She could see the pots and pans hanging on it. And then some 10 to 15 seconds later, her estimate of time was that there was the flickering again. I'd be here and then not here. And then there'd be a twinkling. And then I'd be back totally solid again.
Oh, okay. It's definitely interesting. It seems to suggest, in a lot of ways, the string theory physicists have been coming forward lately and talking about, the universe having more than one or more than, I think it was 11 dimensions or 25 or something like that. And it makes me wonder, maybe you're being displaced when this happens. Maybe, it just bumps everything up to a higher dimension or a different dimension.
That's sort of what I've come to conclude since that experience. And thinking about it, if I were going to do a universe, if somebody handed me a universe shell and said, okay, do something with it, I would make sure that whatever was done in a redundant sort of a form. That is, not knowing what I was doing, I'd say, gee, if I do it this way and something happens, the whole universe disappears. And this is a simplistic way of looking at it. However, I've come to conclude that there are probably many, many, many universes that are, call it just one little bit of minute vibration or time functioning away from the other universes, that we have many, many redundant universes. Some of them are fairly close together in terms of time flow, and some of them are quite a ways apart. And that's the only way I can connect in my own mind anyhow, the time jumping and the fact that I disappeared completely. Now, apparently, when I came back, it looked like I was here and solid and in the same time flow and same everything of our usual 3 or 4 dimension universe. However, with the time jumping around, with my experiencing the time jumping, what I've come to conclude is that I was actually jumping around between parallel time flow universes, but they were so close together that there was really not any big distinguishing difference between them. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, it's kind of the many worlds theory, I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
in the most strict interpretation of it. Well, were there differences, little things like I guess the television plot would have, the clock on the wall would have a different color hand or something like that.
No, everything seemed to be identical, and she was in the house when this happened. When I got into whatever this time jumping was, and we had a number of cats and some dogs, and everything appeared normal. However, there were some recollections that we had of things that we said and did and what have you during actually the effect lasted for about 3 days. come to think that maybe it was sort of like a hysteresis curve where there was big jumpings to begin with, and then they just slowly sort of diminished.
Yeah.
But in any case, when we recalled things that we might have said a day before when I was still caught up in this, her recollections of them were a good bit different than my recollections, but not enough to make any difference in terms of the reality. In other words, we could sit there and I could say, well, gee, I remembered you said this. And she'd say, no, I remember it was this way. And there were differences, but the differences really didn't make any difference in terms of the total reality. And I began wondering after that if maybe times when people, especially couples, maybe married couples, would have different recollections of what was said or what was done, and this could lead to big heated arguments. No, I said this and you said that. And maybe the recollections were absolutely correct, but either person was operating in just a slightly different reality, time frame. Does that make
Oh,
any sense to you?
yeah. It's an interesting idea. That would definitely solve a lot of marital arguments.
Well, yeah. Yeah, except when you're caught up in it, and I imagine all of us who have been married get caught up in it. You know, it's very important that we be absolutely right. And the truth might be that both parties are right. They were just perceiving it from a slightly different time flow.
Well, one of the things that I'd like to ask about is if there are inventors out there who wanted to replicate this effect or wanted to take a stab at trying it, despite probably the inherent danger that there might be with it. Um, what how would you describe the path that they should take to replicate the experiment?
Well, I'm not sure it can be. I piddled around with it a little bit. I haven't really tried to replicate the whole thing, but piddled around with different elements of it to see if I could get a handle on it. And so far, I've never experienced that again. And it may well be, although I can't say one way or the other, it may be that there were certain conditions that allowed what I experienced to happen at the time, and those conditions may never occur again, or they may occur, at 10-year intervals or whatever. I have no idea.
Oh, yeah, and there are so many different variables that might have a minute effect, but might influence something to make a resonance happen.
Yeah, I would point out, though, one thing that was interesting was, one would think, just looking at this, never having experienced it, that it would be rather scary being in that void, knowing that you were someplace and the body had disappeared and all of this. However, I would have to say there was no sense of fear or isolation whatsoever.
Yeah,
And what I've come to conclude is that in order to feel fear, there has to be something really tangible to be afraid of. And when there's nothing there, there's nothing to stimulate the fear. And as far as feeling isolated, there has to be a sense of there being someone or something around to be isolated from. And when there's nothing there, there's no isolation.
sure. It sounds
It's
kind of
just
like
paradoxical.
it sounds like the world without time, and
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I actually read an interesting science fiction book by Stephen King once, where he talked about, I think it was an airplane that got stuck out of time, and the challenge for them was to get back. But you came back normally, and you were bouncing around, and it was both before and after the event happened, right?
Right.
So you would disappear, and then you would appear half an hour later, and then half an
Yeah,
hour before, and
yeah.
yeah.
Well, only 10 or 15 seconds.
Oh, okay.
But my sense, being in that space, I had no sense of the passage of time whatsoever. There was no reference to check flow of time, so it was merely my wife observing and estimating what the time flow was. Now, if I was successful in getting into that state again, I would certainly want somebody around to write down what the actual time was and then write down my perception so that we could chart it and graph it and all of that. And I'd want a video camera going and want to do some real checks to see whether or not I really did disappear, or if there was perhaps some intense gravity field created, which meant light around me, as the center of this gravity field, because that's a possibility as well. Maybe I really didn't disappear. Maybe if it was outdoors and the sun was shining, maybe I would cast a shadow, even though I appeared not to be there.
Well, one of the things that really hadn't occurred to me before, but seems to be at least a remote possibility now, is that you know with all of the rumors and talk about the Montauk project that have happened over the years, if the project really does exist and really does transport people through time as they've described, I guess it's possible that your device might have tapped into their energy, and maybe that would be what enabled it to do so much work with so little input energy.
Well, it could be because they use god-awful amounts of energy for the Montauk experiment. I mean, they were way up there in the thousands of watts of power that they were using.
Yeah. Well, it's the example that I know a little bit more about is Project HARP, and if I remember correctly, they have just like a nuclear reactor coupled to their antenna farm up there. So
I don't know about the reactor. The reason they located it where they did was because they had lots of access to natural gas and used that for their reactors. And I think we got to differentiate in terms of power that they're using a pulse system and they're sending out pulses that are gigawatts of power. However, the average power is a great bit lower than that.
oh,
But
okay.
their antenna farm up there on the drawing board, it was supposed to be 48 phased arrays. I don't know whether they've done that yet or not.
Yeah.
And each antenna had a certain amount of gain to it, so that's factored into the effective radiative power.
Oh, okay.
So, I really don't know about that.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I was wondering if, in closing, if there's anything you'd like to say, just as a, just kind of notes to keep in mind, I guess.
Well, one thing the reason I didn't even say anything except to a handful of people for some 9 or 10 years after the experience was that I was concerned that some people whose motives were less than pure might want to piddle around with this in terms of controlling people or whatever. And then one day I realized that that probably isn't a possibility. Some people told me, well, you went right to the level of creation, and whatever you set your intention on, you could have created, like a pile of gold or whatever. But when I reflected on it, I realized that there's nothing that we consider normal human that can go to this place wherever this place was. No intention can go there. In other words, the potential for abuse of this particular phenomena, whatever it is, I'm convinced is zero.
Oh, okay.
I had no emotions when I went there. The only thing that went there to this void was a sort of like an objective observer. And I couldn't bring any emotions whatsoever with me.
Okay,
So I
well,
don't think there's a chance for any kind of abuse of this experiment. Now, there may be some physical effects that might not be, particularly good for people, so I would caution anybody playing with it just to be aware of any possible physical changes.
yeah. Well, thank you again for your time. And this has been, it's been amazing to get this on tape because it was really impressive to hear you talk about this last year, and so it's great to finally have it on record. But um, so
Well,
I guess,
if anybody would like the pure technical information, on how to replicate the experiment or try to do it, so far as I'm aware, one person tried it and it didn't work.
oh,
But I don't
okay,
know whether they followed exactly, the directions I gave them or not.
yeah. Do you know if there are any resources, anything that people should look up as far as just advice to replicate this?
Not that I'm aware of. No. I mean, there have been little bits I've gathered here and there. An experiment done by IBM where they used powdered iron particles and created what they called a corral for electrons. And, I really haven't gone into the details on it, but I'm sure there's some, everything is weird and mysterious until we begin to understand it.
Sure, sure.
And I would like to do the experiment again, but, and I plan to do it. I just don't know exactly when it's going to be done.
Well,
I want to make sure there's somebody around to take care of me should I spend longer periods of time in the void.
yeah. Once again, it's been nice talking to you, and good luck with future experiments. And I'd like to hopefully do a follow-up interview with you in the near future if you have the
Okay.
time. So,
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed talking with you. You asked some good questions.
thanks again.